We have three great regions here to talk about. I'm not going to be able to read their entire bios. I won't do justice to the wealth of experience that is up here. I'm just going to be very short. There are bios, I think, in the back or when you walked in, so definitely take a look at those because it's really impressive. But starting here on my left, Frank Lenk is the Director of Research Services at the Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas. The group is called MARC. It is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Kansas City region. It includes 119 local governments, 9 counties, 2 states. So clearly he can speak to the challenges and opportunities of regional collaboration, I think, really well. Next to Frank, Robin Snyderman knows as much about, I think, housing and community development as anyone. She is a principal at Brick Partners LLC and a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings at the Metro program. She has done a ton of work in and around Chicago, pioneering new collaborative management strategies, which we're going to hear about. A place like Chicago obviously really needs that. Also done a lot of work nationally, Baltimore, Milwaukee, Buffalo, I think lots of different places. Next to me, Scott Spencer is Associate Director for Advocacy and Influence. It's a great title. At the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore. He is the co-chair of the Opportunity Collaborative, which is charged with creating Metro Baltimore's regional plan for sustainable development. You can all check that out, it's very good. My colleagues and I have worked closely with Scott for a number of years on issues on housing and transport and urban planning over a number of years, and the Casey Foundation provides generous support to the Metro program, which helps make the work that we do possible. So before we begin, I have to reiterate Brookings' commitment to independence and underscore that the views and comments that are expressed here today are solely those of the panelists. I guess by extension, audience questions are solely those of the audience. Tweets are those of the tweeters. Hashtag pathways too, don't forget. But I think it's important. We want to hear this range of perspectives. These are really, really complicated issues. As we got into with the secretaries, it's clearly important to hear the variety of stakeholder concerns that go into this, because it's not just about housing, it's not just about transport. We talked about schools, we talked about lots of different things. So we have to hear from a diversity of opinions on this one. HUD's final rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing didn't just come out of nowhere. It didn't just come out of the last year. We've had fair housing laws on the books for a generation, and my colleagues Alan Berube and Natalie Holmes note that since the Fair Housing Act became law 45 years ago, the country has become, as we all know, much more racially and ethnically diverse. Poverty in metro areas has shifted well beyond its historical confines into away from inner city neighborhoods. So although poverty rates are still much higher, as we all know, in center cities, today more poor people live in suburban places. The problem then is that most anti-poverty policies and programs were not built with the suburbs in mind. So we talked a lot about the historical context, which was a good question earlier today, but things are really, really different right now. Development patterns are different. Where the poor people live, obviously, is different. So for us here at Brookings Metro, and I'm sure to many folks in the room, we talk about fair housing and increasing access to high opportunity places. That means taking a regional and metropolitan area approach. So the rule, I don't think, is a top-down kind of federal mandate. This isn't something that Washington is just imposing, but really strikes me as a partnership and a response to what's going on in the real world in cities and metro areas all across the country, both the good and the positive initiatives, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, as well as ongoing and unfortunately probably intractable challenges in a lot of places. So let me stop talking and turn it over to the panel and start off with one broad question for everybody. In the rule book, HUD notes that in the Fair Housing Rule Book, to be effective, housing must tackle tough issues. They use that term, tough issues. So describe for us in your community, what are those tough issues? What are the key things? And what do you think the rule is going to do to address them? Let's start with Frank, and then we'll just go ahead and down the line here.
So I'll start out with something you alluded to, that we're pretty spread out. We have a lot of cities and counties. We work really well across those counties on most issues, but it does create a dynamic that with the poverty that's still concentrated in the core, that there's areas of opportunity, areas where opportunity is deficient. And that makes cooperation on some issues harder. Economic development is one of those issues. Issues of affordable housing is another. So that remains an issue. And I think poverty may be more poor people in the suburbs, but the poverty in the core is still a different kind of poverty. It's a real poverty of place. Poverty is still really concentrated, and it's still largely minority poverty. So
More highly concentrated in the city.
where 2/3, to 3/4 of poor African Americans or poor Hispanics live in areas of concentrated poverty, only 1/3 of whites. Now that's a huge increase from where we were in 1990, when only 15% of poor whites lived in concentrated poverty. So I think that creates some anxiety among the majority population, and that's both an opportunity and a little bit scary.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to you and all your colleagues at Brookings for continuing to focus on metro strategies for advancing housing and economic development at the needed scale. Local leadership and tools are still essential, but housing and community development challenges rarely adhere to municipal borders or public housing authority borders or county borders. There are so many efficiencies to be gained from local leaders joining forces to advance shared priorities, even via shared staff and shared programs. So it's very encouraging to see the progress on these issues thanks to the leadership at HUD and Department of Transportation and other federal agencies like EPA and Economic Development Administrations. And trailblazers at the local level really need, they benefit from this kind of momentum and some of the innovations proposed in the 2017 budget. As to tough issues and how the AFFH rule helps, I'm thinking of Secretary Castro's phrase, hand-to-hand combat. The two issues I thought I'd raise are capacity and community acceptance, which are both different ways of looking at hand-to-hand combat. At the simplest level, interagency coordination or silo busting, as Secretary Castro kept saying, is a challenge. I applaud the two gentlemen who are up here with Amy for role modeling how to do this. But I see a couple of my colleagues from who are here like me, who got their initial footing in the housing field at a little community development corporation in San Francisco. And I remember, even at that level, the way the housing developers and the social service providers and the property managers and the tenant organizers, it really had a hard time being on the same page, recognizing they were all equally important. They needed to be advancing the same strategy. And I recognize a lot of people in this room today who are from larger, planning and advocacy civic organizations who have exchanged a lot of war stories with each other about how to get their housing and transportation colleagues understanding each other and respecting each other's priorities and applying them at the same time and in the same place. So then, pan out to the regional level that Frank was talking about to answer your question. And the first key challenge I'll focus on is just sustaining the capacity to be effective in the suburbs, working at the right scale with the needed level of technical and political support. So housing authorities, municipalities, nonprofits, they all struggle with this. And yes, the new rule helps. It provides the metrics to assess demand from a lot of different perspectives, right? Encouraging a broader dialogue among entities that don't always talk to each other, don't always agree with each other, don't always understand each other. And so it provides the opportunity for silo busting and collaboration so that not just neighboring towns and counties and municipalities, but the fair housing field, and I think this is what you were getting at, Solomon, the neighborhood revitalization field, the regional planners can all sit down with towns and housing authorities and hopefully people who care about workforce stability and education and come up with a joint approach. There are a lot of talented and knowledgeable housing experts who really care about access to opportunity, whether through new options near good jobs and good schools and good transit or through community revitalization. But to sustain the interagency thing and the interjurisdictional thing is a really tough nut to crack. And I commend MPOs like Kansas City, like Baltimore's in the room. Chicago has an amazing metropolitan planning organization, CMAP, for stepping up to the plate, even though there's not really core funding to sustain this effort yet. And Alan Berube and Elizabeth Niebel's work on suburban poverty really spotlights the lack of both public and private resources, and it spotlights the innovation. But this sort of gets to the second key issue, and then I'm going to wrap up, I promise. We all know from experience that persuasive data and studies aren't necessarily enough to open doors and create opportunities in areas that have been out of reach. So capacity is not only about the technical know-how and support, but also about the effective communications and Amy, I think you asked this question really well, needed to anticipate and address the political realities and gain community acceptance. Many suburban mayors in opportunity areas over the years have been really frank about the barriers that interfere with their ability to inspire the local support needed to introduce new housing options, even a small senior housing development in their community, let alone address the challenge at the needed scale. The advocacy, housing resources are often insufficient, but when transportation dollars are dangled out there, and many of these, and repeating what I heard from the suburban mayors, that if they're told they're going to be less likely to receive transportation and economic developers unless they are thinking about whether there's housing affordable to the workforce near that transportation, then that changes things. That is compelling. Similarly, when employers step up and say, we need housing that's affordable to our local workforce so that they're not coming to work tired. And again, I think the AFFH rule provides the impetus for that dialogue. In Illinois, which, as you were saying earlier, is notorious for its appetite for local control, with 280 some municipalities in the Chicago region alone. HUD and Transportation and Brookings have all helped local leaders try a few replicable and scalable innovations. There are municipal and public housing authority collaboratives. More recently, Cook County's new strategic plan got the okay from HUD and EDA to focus, to have the same timeline, to have the same deadlines, to look at housing and jobs and workforce development in the same place at the same time. That it was a rocket science, to
from the
get
federal government.
From the federal government. It seemed so obvious, but it took a lot of work, and to get to yes took a lot of work, and then to implement and roll it out is takes a lot of leadership at the local level. So, around the country, we've had the chance to work with some of Scott's inspiring colleagues in Baltimore. I see Dan in the back of the room, and the PHAs, as well as Frank and his colleagues in Kansas. And like Chicago, they're pulling in a diverse set of partners. But while the new data that HUD is providing makes it easier to convene the conversation, I think the challenge is to sustain it and to staff it.
Great.
So, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for having the two secretaries. I think the candor of their comments, their questions about, and their answers to the questions about both the role and the limits of government are really a good point to begin that type of a conversation. And I think it's a really good place to start. For me, the big challenge that we face in the region, and I would take your question another 20 years back to the homeowner loan corporations redlining. It's almost 80 years ago that law came into effect. And if you sit in Baltimore and actually if you overlay the maps of data that point out racial disparity based on childhood outcomes, based on ability to learn, succeed, find jobs, have access to decent housing, they basically overlay those maps. And so I think Secretary Castro's sort of entree around the discussion with Freddie Gray was very much sort of really helped to tee that up, is what is the big challenge in our region. And I say that because this is a structural discussion. This is not a discussion about an individual or how someone else feels about someone else. This is about a system that was laid in place generations ago that is hardwired and has a lasting impact. And so what the federal rule does, and what it actually helps to do, or what I hope it will help to do, is to start to daylight that. Mm-hmm. And it sort of gets to Solomon's question as to, by providing the information, by providing the data, hopefully it will create a groundswell of both action and really compulsion by people to say, this is not the way we need to be. And there are lots of reasons for it, and I think Secretary Fox alluded to it, because it's not about black and white, black, brown, or white. It's about green. The way we're sitting right now with the lack of access to decent, affordable housing, and I had to make sure we had to put the word decent in there, because you can find affordable housing in East and West Baltimore. It is not decent in lots of cases. and the gaps that it provides between where you live and where you get to work. Those are the challenges that we face. And what we saw last April in our city, and what, the mapping of what you see of opportunity in West Baltimore highlights, is that there is very little in way of access to opportunity for low-income people in Baltimore, either from the housing perspective or from the access to jobs perspective. And so I will leave it there because I know we have much more conversation, and I could probably jump into these points of the conversation. But for me, it was really the challenge of overcoming and really having frank discussions like we were starting to have just now around racialized policies that have been set in place. And my term for it is that it has been around so long that it has become the DNA of our systems. And so that is a hard thing to change over a period of time, and a rulemaking may not necessarily do it, but it may actually start to begin the process to unravel that DNA.
And that's where I was going to go just there. The rule itself doesn't get to some of those amazingly structural problems that we're not going to be able to hammer through. But I think it gets to your point about capacity, Robin, and each of you talked about it a little bit. And I don't want to start with too of a wonky question to begin, but this issue of connecting up the PHA, the public housing authorities with the MPOs.
Did you just call me a wonk?
We're all wonks. We're all wonks here. It's actually okay to say. But, so describe in Chicago in particular how you've linked up then the PHAs with the MPOs, because we talked about it earlier in the panel. We mentioned these three regions as MPOs that are thinking about this. It doesn't strike me that this is the norm in MPOs across the country. They're still very traditional in a lot of ways. They're still very transport focused. How did you do that at an MPO in Chicago, and actually for you guys as well? I think because both of you have dealt a little bit.
So the initiative that you're talking about is called the Regional Housing Initiative. And when it began, it was actually before the creation of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. It began with just 3 of our public housing authorities and our Housing Finance Agency and the Metropolitan Planning Council, which is an independent, nonprofit, regional policy and advocacy organization. And now RHI is facilitated by CMAP, and it includes 10 of our region's public housing authorities. There are 15, so we still have a ways to go.
15 in the region.
To 15 in the region, but the bulk of the largest ones are involved right now, and our Housing Finance Agency has increased its role as well. And it started in a very different market, and I want to stress that because I think the versatility of this initiative in different markets is part of what makes me confident that it is replicable and scalable, not to mention the interest of Baltimore, which is just rolling one out now, St. Louis, which seems to be very interested in getting something going. And this particular initiative obviously started before the AFFH metrics, but similarly, it was born out of data. There was a regional rental market analysis that really showed how the housing stock was not accommodating the population and jobs boom, especially outside of the city of Chicago.
Who was doing that analysis?
It was analysis that HUD largely funded together with the state and the city of Chicago and the Housing Authority, that University of Illinois, Urban Institute, and a group called Area did. So there was quantitative, there was interviews with developers and housing choice voucher holders and employers and elected officials. And it started at the point in time when the Chicago Housing Authority was looking at tearing down its high rises and was required to either redevelop them or voucher out, and had to figure out what the market could absorb. And the advocacy was to look at the regional level, and it was at a point in time when a new business group was started, Metropolis 2020, was talking at the time about what they called the alleged jobs housing mismatch. So there was the conception of thinking regionally at that point. And I think one of the surprises to many people was not so much that the housing stock was shrinking in the suburbs when jobs and population was booming, but just realizing that while housing authorities were really getting beat up for segregating people, and there was a lot of segregation, and obviously Chicago is still perhaps the worst in the nation on this, the truth was that in areas where there were good schools and good jobs and good transit, there was a shortage of multifamily rental stock. There wasn't the supply there. So the premise was that these housing authorities would just pool some of the turnover of their tenant-based vouchers. And HUD allows them to project-base up to 20%, but at this point in time, they just said 10% of this year's turnover. And that was step one, to agree to do that. But then to decide how and where to invest those vouchers, I guess I should have stressed, the other thing was not just that there wasn't a supply in those areas, but that the housing authorities like DuPage Housing Authority, McHenry Housing Authority, that might have been the more desirable places with good jobs and good schools, had little housing authorities and not a lot of vouchers and no development track record. At the same time, the suburban mayors were meeting and talking about the data, and they formed for the first time ever a housing committee. On top, they already had a caucus, but they formed a housing committee, and they spent a really long time talking about how to take leadership on this issue and stay in office. And at the end of a lot of discussions, they came up with some very basic housing endorsement criteria that said if the housing is affordable to the local workforce and a range of others, if it's well managed, well designed, near transportation, near jobs, then it's good and we need it, and we will give incentives to developers, and we will preserve and we will support housing authorities. So the Regional Housing Initiative the selection criteria were based on those criteria, which helped build a lot of community acceptance. And then our Housing Finance Agency at the time gave 3 extra points to developers who came to us first. Now it's a lot more than that. It's 10 just for the vouchers. It's another 10 if it's an opportunity area or a revitalization area. So there's, for developers, that makes it so much easier to see all those funders lining up.
Did that get fed in then to the regional planning process that the MPO was doing? Did it affect transport spending, for example, in this case?
So more recently, HUD invested as a pilot in the Regional Housing Initiative, and part of the assignment was to find a permanent home for it. It was a long-standing pilot, and that's when CMAP came in. And I think for CMAP, it was a big decision to the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and what they had the Fair Housing Equity Assessment, right? They'd received that through the Sustainable Communities Initiative, so they increased the metrics. But they also had been doing TA to municipalities all over the region, and suddenly this could be introduced as a reward, right, to developers and towns that were advancing the regional goals.
Is there a similar story then in Kansas City? I mean, also another highly fragmented metro area, 2 different states. How did the MPO take on such a large role when it comes to promoting fair housing?
Well, I think our role is different. The public housing authorities still are fairly fragmented, I would say, and our entry into this is with helping the local governments prepare a regional analysis of impediments, and then the FHEA, the Fair Housing Equity Assessment, as well. And now we're involved with the city of Kansas City, Missouri, who is one of those first 22 metropolitan communities, having to fulfill the new requirement under the AFH. So. Our work has been to help with the analysis and help the understanding, and then also to bring the larger community together. When we approached other communities in the region about doing a regional AFH, which is what HUD's desire is, one of the issues was that most of the communities don't have to do it until 2019. Only KCMO has to do it this year. And so getting those schedules synced up is a really difficult issue to try and figure out. But they're all willing to do it. They all would see the value in doing it, but the timing of how we do it. So we're trying to do an initial study that will create a framework for our regional analysis.
The MPO will do the study?
We'll do it with the city of Kansas City, Missouri, under contract to them. And then do that in a way that the other cities can join in as their time comes forward. So there's a lot of interest in working together and addressing the issues that really need to be addressed regionally at that scale. But there's a lot of technical issues in preventing that.
And this issue of fragmentation strikes me because, as you were saying, that Scott, that this is one of those structural issues, right? There's just the proliferation of local governments. And Chicago is the most fragmented in the country, arguably. Kansas City is very fragmented. Baltimore is not. It's actually one of the least fragmented in the country. But there has to be something. There has to be something else then that's behind this besides just the proliferation of, or the lack of the proliferation of local governments in Baltimore.
That created our process, or where we've gone to? Well, in a frank sense, failure led to collaboration. I mean, and our failure was we wanted to win the HUD Sustainable Communities Grant, and we didn't get it the first time, and sort of the failure in the process of doing that actually led us to a truth, and the truth was in the data, and the data really pointed out that we live in a superiorly wealthy region. And where the richest county and Baltimore City are, it's about a 60% difference in median income. Within Baltimore City itself, there's probably almost another 30% difference in median income. And the jobs access issue, and so the data just laid itself out, in certain ways, laid itself out for us that the issues of housing, transportation, and workforce development were the issues that needed to be addressed. And so the wisdom of collaboration with a bunch of brave people coming together, and really people who, in certain ways, may have, can sometimes sit at odds with one another. Government, advocacy groups, and somebody sitting in the middle, to help to sort of calm the waters, or help to facilitate the process, really enabled us to identify those three areas as the way to work and really try to move the path forward together. For us, that the resulting factor was that our state legislature paid attention to what was coming out of our HUD Sustainable Communities process, and they were then inspired to really change the charge of the MPO. And to expand the charge of the MPO from its historic role as the principal transportation planner to add on the responsibility of housing and transportation to its work. For our work around, we did the AI as a part of the original Sustainable Communities process, and I think again part of this daylighting process. And sort of the collaboration amongst the regions or the counties within the region led to their co-investment. Because originally when we actually did the grant, we were going to hire somebody to do the housing work, and they were going to be a part-time person. It was the county's acknowledgement of the importance of the outcomes of the AI to actually then co-invest. To up the role of the person to be a full-time person. That person is still there doing the work, which is a good thing because the counties are continuing to invest in that work. And so we are a 2019. We're going to be a 2019 region, and right now I can't remember the title of it, but it's like the Baltimore Regional Fair Housing Collaboration or something like that. But it is the combination of the counties, the housing authorities that are going to be doing the regional analysis. They're also going to be doing an individual jurisdictional analysis so that they can figure out how to work either in the regional context, which I think would be personally I think it would be the ideal thing, but also it gives them the latitude to address the issues, the contextual issues that reside in their jurisdiction, and to allow them to use their land use discretion that they have, and quite honestly probably don't want to give up, to really work on addressing the issues of the impediments to fair housing.
Can I add something? So I would say that one thing that we are successful at is in broadening the discussion of equity beyond housing, and how we are we put an equity lens into virtually everything that we do. We created a new set of a planning policy of planning sustainable places, where the equity we created an equity network of people that are involved in this in equity every day, and they have a voice in our transportation funding decisions and in our planning decisions, and that happens every time we meet. We build partnerships really well in Kansas City. We're Kansas City nice, or someone said the intersection between nice and smart. We like that one. And so whether we're working on homelessness issues or on new financing mechanisms, I think financing is one of those places where right now the money is very specific generally, and it's hard to leverage, and so consequently not enough gets done with the money. The idea one of the great things about this partnership between DOT and HUD is the increased flexibility. Look at how much energy that you're able to create by saying, well, here's a little bit of money. You guys figure out how to spend it the best. By the way, you can leverage other federal money with it. And you just get a ton more and higher quality work that has a bigger impact because it makes local sense. And then we work on all aspects of this, so not just housing and transportation, but working on the jobs part. So we have a whole another initiative with the business community around trade, talent, and innovation that we call KC Rising. And then we're also active in workforce, so trying to get a better workforce system that works better with business. So we have a demand-led, a business-led talent production system. And also working on all the getting both new entrants into college and adult learners as well, because we have 300,000 folks who have started college but not finished a degree. So the opportunity agenda is much broader than just housing and transportation. It includes jobs, it includes education, and we're involved in all of that. And basically, we're opportunistic. Wherever there is energy, where we can find partnerships and engage folks, that's what we're going to be.
I mean, I think we're looking to become more opportunistic, but I would say that one of the things that is leading us to the pathway is, again, the uncovering of information along our path to the Regional Plan for Sustainable Development really sort of, again, highlighted the need for intersectionality. So much to I think a lot of people's surprise in the Baltimore region, when we did a survey of workers and employers about what the barriers were to employment opportunity. Now, we would think that it was probably going to be somewhere around criminal records or histories or things like that. The number one barrier was transportation. So while we may have been chasing down the pathway of expungements, which are really important to do, and things like that, if we're not starting to address the issue of what the connectivity is to that last mile, what the connectivity is to the first mile, what the connectivity is around the cost of transportation, and how we're dealing with that, then we're not really starting to address the issues that are principally impacting the people, and that's what's gotten us to this point of really working with the transportation folks, the workforce investment boards, and everyone, and actually some housing folks around making those connections stronger.
So that's a great point. In Kansas City, I think our latest estimate is that only 9% of jobs are accessible by transit within a 60-minute commute. And so we have a Tiger grant, so a transportation grant, to double that access over the next 10 years, which is great. It still won't be a lot of jobs, so there's a lot of work to be done in promoting transportation access to jobs. But I will also point out that when we had to do the fair housing equity analysis, our most poverty-impacted, racially concentrated areas of poverty are right next to our biggest corridor of jobs with great transit access to it. So it's more than just transit. And if you look in the detail, what you find is that there's 9,000 people in this one area that have jobs that don't have a high school education. All the jobs that are around there, most of them, not all of them, but most of them require at least a high school or better degree. And so there's this big educational mismatch.
We made progress on getting transport as part of this discussion, but I think clearly you're right. It's not enough. It's not the only thing that we can get to. I want to go to the audience soon. How are we doing on time? Are we okay? I did want to ask one more question before we go to the audience, though, on this issue of incentives, because this is what we keep getting to when we work in these regions. What are the incentives for the local governments to work together? Everybody's so parochial, all this kind of stuff. We talked about 3 incentives, I think, so far, 3 motivators. Nice and smart. I don't know if we can replicate that everywhere besides Kansas City, but elsewhere. The money, talked about the little bit of green, that they're actually some federal money or some other kind of sources actually does go a long way. Then you talk about getting the business community involved, making it more of an economic kind of impact, irrespective of the social and equity lens, that there's a business case. Are there other incentives that we should be thinking about, things that you've seen that's worked, things that other communities can take from that?
I think the other one that Frank mentioned was just sort of loosening the regulatory environment a little bit. I wanted to stress that in talking about that regional housing initiative, there was a convening at the end of January, and this gets to your question, where 7 regions were brought together. And soon after we left, we found out in the 2017 budget, there is a regional mobility demo to support up to 10 regions. ideally with money that's proposed in the budget, and let's let everybody go out and vote for that, but also by letting HUD know what sort of waivers are needed to support, especially the consortia idea, right? There's not a consortia rule right now, let alone a partial consortia rule, so that housing authorities can pilot certain programs together but not throw everything in. And there's also language in there about working with the private sector. And I know in Chicago and in conversations with Baltimore, thinking about how to be very intentional about introducing this issue to address the self-interest of the business community and developers. That's a real challenge, a worthy challenge.
What Secretary Castro said about humanizing really resonated with me, that none of this happens without really strong engagement of all the communities in the process and giving them a real meaningful role in the decision making. I think that's one of the things that helps make this happen. And then the other thing that makes it happen is success. And so, in the downtown area, which has been had its difficulties, we have a new starter streetcar line and other place-based investments that have allowed a charter school to open up, and now it's merging with another charter school to create a high school downtown. First time that's ever happened. We haven't had a high school downtown since I can remember anyway. And so, that builds families, which then makes a more attractive place, and one of those charter schools, I'll give a plug to my wife's school. It's in a choice neighborhood. It's in a depressed neighborhood with a high minority population, free and reduced lunch population. But now they have access to a high school that really in an opportunity area that they wouldn't have had before.
Hard to believe that it's one of the first high schools in the downtown area. It's mind-boggling when you think about it.
One thing I'd add, in some of the work that's been going on in Baltimore, one of the groups that we've worked with has been looking at what it would take to grow sort of the African American middle class, and part of the incentive around strategy, really looking at policies and strategies that promote stronger equity. There is a very strong economic component to it. It points out that by helping people increase their income, the increase to city tax rolls, the increase to state tax receipts, the decrease in crime, the increase in home ownership. Right. Again, if you don't want to do it. I think I've heard Mayor Hodges from Minneapolis say it. If you don't want to do it for the moral reasons, do it for the economic reasons. But it's true. There's enough information out there that says by moving the needle on these metrics, that it is either an economic boost to the region, or it is a cost saver to the individual. And if you can talk to the individual about how it might be able to put more money into their pockets because you're not paying money to institutionalize someone, to keep someone on a government support role, and they are able to be contributing members of society, humanizing them, then I think there's a very strong argument to be made for that.
You've moved a lot worse issues from economic.
And I'd say one more thing that we do this in a way so that everyone benefits. So all communities are talking about more mixed use, communities for all ages, which gets the young and the old, which allows us to talk about disability. Talks about lower affordable housing for the young, which can be affordable housing for anyone. And so there's ways to talk about it. Good language really helps.
I think we need to do a better job at that for sure. So let's take some questions. I know there's mic runners around here. Please identify yourself, your organization, and try to keep your questions short. My boss, or Strobe Talbot here, says your voice should go up at the end if it's a question. So keep away from statements and go for questions.
I'm Sandy Apgar, Baltimore. I live in one of those high net worth communities about 1 mile from Freddie Gray's. So your comments are very telling, very appropriate. As both Rob and Amy know, I've been a practitioner of public-private partnerships for some time, and with a particular emphasis on the private business aspect of P3s. And the question, which is as much for the previous panel as you, but from your collective perspective locally, can we realistically continue the governance model of federal departments being, in effect, the innovators to create programs and then push them out, versus a different model we see in the private sector where the federal departments, in effect, become investors, venture capitalists, those who provide the funding, but enable and, of course, incentivize the local and regional innovators to invent and innovate. That's a sea change, obviously. The one federal department that, in effect, is built on this model, despite its bureaucracy, is the Defense Department, which creates a market and an industry for the private sector and increasingly for innovation. There may be others that I'm less familiar with, but that is a governance question, and from your local perspective and experience, as well as the scholarship that may be behind this, would welcome your view.
I'd argue that actually, I think it is starting to change. I think we've seen some examples with a little bit of that the federal government is starting to recognize that they're not going to have it. Those days of these big federal programs are kind of playing themselves out.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I had the Defense Department's budget to incent partnerships and collaboration, I'd be very happy too and see a lot of it happen. But I think I agree. I mean, I actually think what the Sustainable Communities effort did. And having been party and involved in a previous generation of stuff with the Empowerment Zone, what the $3.5 million allowed us to do in the Baltimore region was one, to bring together a table of folks to really focus in on the contextual solutions that are germane to us in the region, and so really for us to be able to set up a blueprint in order to do that. The second thing it enabled us to do, the requirement of using 10% of the dollars for community engagement. If I were to give advice, I probably would have said, if there were a way we should have probably invested more in that. But one component that we were able to do out of that was actually to set up an Opportunity Fellows program, which was really creating the opportunity for 34, 35 people, local people to dig into the work of the Regional Plan for Sustainable Development and to become sort of this next generation of leadership to push the change. So when I say the daylighting of the FHEA was a good thing, hopefully those folks will actually be a part of the process that will hold hold a level of accountability to systems that this has to continue and that this has to be able to move forward. So I mean, I think it started the process. We didn't have the resources to finish it, but there are a lot of creative minds out there, and I'm looking back at the director of our the Baltimore Metropolitan Council as really one of the true thinkers about thinking smartly about how to pull resources, connect resources, and really try to move elements into action around this. And that's with $3.5 million. So
let's do this idea we did before. Let's have a question from the audience, and then we have a Twitter question or comment. Not yet. All right, let's go for a question from the audience. Right down here.
Thank you.
Twitter's in there.
My name is Carl Campbell. I'm on the board of directors of two public companies, and both of the companies are involved in housing. In 1923, the French architect Le Corbusier said that building is at the root of social unrest. And I think that's largely true today. I worked at HUD under President Nixon and Secretary Romney. I worked at Commerce as the Assistant Secretary for Economic Development under President Reagan. I've been to 55 countries. If you check the website for livable cities, you'll find that there are none of the cities in the United States amongst the top 10 livable cities in the world. I have a question about scale and commitment. The question about scale is this. When we have hurricanes, you'll find that it takes tens of billions of dollars, somewhere between 30 and 70 billion dollars, to deal with Katrina. If you look at Sandy, I think that was north of $30 billion. I've been to, I don't know if I said I've been to 55 countries. You look around the United States, you'll see cities like Reading, Pennsylvania, Stockton, California, Camden, New Jersey. They're all going south. I won't even mention Detroit. But my question is this, and by the way, I was interviewed last Friday by the New York Times about the fair housing, because when I came here in 1965, I was turned out by 39 different places. And one of the things that I found was that HUD was part of the problem. It wasn't called HUD then, it was HHFA. That the area-wide commissioner, Childs, actually lied to me about the need to have the federal government exercise leverage because President Kennedy had written a executive order. Coincidentally, my father was the founder of a bank in New York and was a close friend of Bob Weaver's, so he was able to get Childs called on the carpet. I wrote a one-page letter and got the River House desegregated, 1,661 units. My question is this, you interrupt me, I was going to tell you. My question is this. I personally, from my experience, feel that the government is not really committed to not only fair housing, but equitable housing and sustainable housing. And to put that in context, my question really is this. It's about commitment, a serious commitment along the lines of the scale. And why is it that the governments of England and Scandinavia can build sustainable housing? It's not about, the difference in the ethnicity, but why are their governments committed and our government is not? I think we're going around in a merry-go-round. I've been listening to this for over 50 years, and it's always this program, that program, this program, but nobody is really meeting, dealing with the issue of ethnicity and the concentration and the isolation of poverty and the drugs and all of that. Last point. If you check out the website for City Observatory, you will find the proliferation of what I call dystopian neighborhoods is increasing exponentially, and we aren't really solving this problem. We're talking about it, and we're having, isolated, interesting names, but we really are not cutting through. So that's my question.
Got it. So, other international examples? I mean, what are we doing here what can we learn from other places? I think that's where I got the question. I think the nut of the question was there's a lot of things that are happening internationally. Are there things that we can learn from elsewhere? What's wrong with the structure we have here? We talked a lot about the structural problems with the city. Are there structural problems on the federal level?
And I would look to Brookings to answer that one.
I mean, the thing that I think that if I read the question right is that, we haven't humanized the poor and disadvantaged and the people that are racially isolated. And so we have this persistent problem of underfunding what we don't really perceive as a problem. And in this era of where racism isn't quite as overt, we've sort of shifted from where racism is more covert and more about perception than it is about stated belief. And so that makes it even harder sometimes to get the resource and get the problem understood. Right. But I don't know what to do about it other than to keep raising the issue. And
things in Europe and elsewhere are changing, as we know, dramatically, so it's hard to find places that are doing things right. Do we have time for one more? We have time for one more question. Got a mic right here? And keep it to a question.
Yes, thank you all very much. I'm concerned about the lack of income integration as opposed to the historical effects of de jure segregation into de facto, and particularly in suburbs where I live in a suburb near here, across the river, and the goal of the county is essentially separate but equal. No integration economically. You have schools with 90% people on free and reduced lunch, and other schools in the same school system with none. And the goal of the school board and the county is essentially we want to bring up the low income, but not have income integration within the schools. So my question to you all is, are you seeing that? Is that just a goal you'd like to have, that at least they're equal? Is that a good goal? Is that a goal that's sufficient?
So we talk a lot about mixed income housing. That's clearly where we need to move. It's a hard thing to do, I think, but that is I wouldn't say the goal is to segregate. Is that by income? Is that what you're saying?
But if you have single family areas,
Uh-huh.
and then you have other areas, what you end up getting often
And lots of different ways, yeah.
So our land use planning, is around mixed use centers where you would mix up single family, multifamily, multiple uses, and so you would have within a community, a more integrated environment. Have we achieved it yet? No, but that's certainly what we're planning for.
So my short answer is no. That is not a good goal. But I would give. It's funny. There's a woman from East Baltimore who talks about, and not that I'm promoting segregation at all, but she talked about how when Baltimore was a segregated city, probably differently segregated in some ways, but when it was a segregated city, that in one neighborhood you would have doctors, lawyers, because because they couldn't they might not be able to go to white doctors. You had black doctors, black lawyers, black this, black that, sitting and living next door to the Department of Public Works person, and so on and so forth. And there is an integration. There is enough evidence out there that talks about the benefits to all of having people of mixed incomes blending together. And by the separation of zoning, and really it's a zoning question, of people by zoning, which then sets up separation by income. What you're doing is sort of perpetuating this cycle. You're really actually reinforcing the DNA structure that I talked about. You're just doing it in a different way with a different set of coding. And that's the stuff we need to work on deconstructing. But as long as, well, I won't say as long as, but zoning is the province of local jurisdictions. And someone said to me once that if you really, really want to see change happen, go to a zoning board meeting.
Secretaries both talked about their days as mayors. We still remember those. So we'll leave it there on a really easy issue like that. That's kind of
right.
end on. The secretaries, they start late. They went a little bit over. I think they had a great conversation. But we do have to cut off here. I want to be respectful to the panelists and to everybody in the room. I thought we, in true Brookings style, we kind of raised more questions than we answered. I think we clearly demonstrated this is complicated stuff. A lot of things that are moving in the right direction, but we have an awful long way to go. I think these issues about partnerships was a really good one. I think we need to keep proliferating those. We need to pursue more of those innovations between organizations. All this around the incentives. How do you actually get people to do the right thing? Local land use and zoning is top of that list. And Frank, your issue of how do you put equity into everything? How do you make this part of the conversation so it's not something that we do over here, but it actually is the thread that connects throughout. And then housing and transport don't seem like these two foreign things that we're connecting, but it actually matters very much. So I want to thank the panel. I want to thank our events team for pulling together a great event. I think video and web clips will be posted on our website soon, so check back for those. This conversation clearly doesn't end right here. We know the administration is going to stay engaged in this. I know the panelists are going to stay engaged in this. We're going to stay engaged in it at Brookings, and I hope you all will too. So thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists.